President Trump was far more rational 8 or 9 months ago when he recognized there was nothing happening in this area called Eastern Ukraine that justified the expenditure of American blood and treasure, nothing to be won, and that he really wanted to end the war.
So recently, Colonel Macgregor went on Andrew Napolitano's podcast to talk a little bit about how Trump has betrayed us all on Ukraine regarding the new policy of resupplying Ukrainians with weapons, even after campaigning on the idea that he was going to end this conflict and end U.S. involvement. Macgregor's been following this from the start. Many of his predictions have completely proven out here, so I want to hear what he has to say about the ramifications of this and how long he thinks the war will continue. So let's check out what he has to say. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
President Trump, just about 15 minutes ago, it's now Monday, early Monday afternoon, announced a seismic shift, a dramatic increase in the amount of arms the United States would be sending to Ukraine through a circuitous route of selling them to allies who will then either sell them or give them to Ukraine. But the numbers are vastly increased over what they were even in the Biden administration. How do you read this, Colonel?
Well, I suppose if we look at it from the standpoint of what could have been announced and wasn't announced, it probably is not nearly as dangerous as it could have otherwise been. Originally, there were discussions of trying to impose a no-fly zone, which didn't make a lot of sense since the Russians very rarely fly manned aircraft over Ukraine. Virtually everything is unmanned or missiles or drones, whatever you want to call them. So that didn't make a lot of sense. Then there was this discussion of monumental tariffs that would be imposed on Russia, and it looks like President Trump has backed away from that, punting the whole thing 50 days into the future, which I think is probably the least damaging thing he could do for himself at this point. So what are these weapons? I don't know. I mean, obviously, we're going to try and send them Patriot missiles. I don't know what else we have planned. I don't see us providing any of the standard missile family, SM-2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so forth. So I don't know what else we're giving them or selling to our allies. I don't know what the allies are going to provide.
Yeah, I mean, this represents a complete turn face to what he campaigned on, but it is in line to some extent with what he did in his first term. Remember, he did supply the missiles and Javelin systems and about $400 million worth of weapons to Ukraine in his first term. This was after, his instinct was actually not to send it at first, and then the Democrats said, hey, you have to send this, and there was a lot of political pressure on him to send those payments in the form of those weapons. He ultimately did. They still impeached him over it, and as of a few months ago, he still boasted about doing that, by the way. But it does ramp up the U.S. presence in that theater after he campaigned on this issue. And this was one of the key points of his entire agenda that he campaigned on, that he was going to end the war in Ukraine, negotiate with Russia. I can do it in 24 hours, he said. So this represents a big, big slap in the face to a lot of the supporters that supported him, some of which bit their tongues saying, hey, I can't handle Harris. I don't exactly maybe like Trump, but I'm going to vote for him just for the hope of ending this insane war against a nuclear power in Eastern Europe and Asia. So, this is correct. Macgregor is talking about how this maybe could be worse if they instituted a no-fly zone. I think that would have been off the table. That would have essentially guaranteed the invocation of a hot war, invoking NATO Treaty Article 5 in the process. So we'll have to see how this pans out.
I was prepared for a stupid comment endorsing the decision of Chancellor Merz to use Taurus missiles against the Russians for the purpose of attacking the manufacturing facilities inside Russia that turn out so many weapons and missiles and rockets and so forth. Didn't hear that. So on the one hand, I think the glass is half full. In other words, it could have been much worse. And I don't know that what we're sending is really going to have much impact. I really don't think it will.
Interesting. I'm actually surprised he has this take. He's been very critical of Trump's decision to continue supplies and aid to Ukraine, but it's good to hear from him, who really follows these things and knows the military backwards and forwards to know that it could have been worse, but I can't help to think that we're still going to be locked in this struggle with no territorial advances on the Ukrainian side anyway in the Donbass, where, Russians control about 90% of it, and the territory that comprises Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And there's a real possibility that, there could be a renewed offensive to go as far as Odessa, maybe. I don't think the Kyiv regime itself is being threatened with the resources Russia is throwing at this thing, but there's no sense that I have that much territorial change will happen at all. The last time that even happened was the summer of 2024, and all Ukrainian advances into the Donbass had already been pushed back by the early months of 2025.
What do they think they're accomplishing? I mean, I don't want to get too political, Colonel, because I want to prevail upon your military expertise. In the same breath in which he made this announcement, he said, it's Joe Biden's war, it's not my war. It is his war if he's going to continue and even increase the rate of military supplies. So, bigger picture, have the neocons become triumphant? Is this Lindsey Graham waging the war?
Well, I don't think Lindsey Graham could be very happy right now because he had hoped to achieve more. And I think he did the best that he could do in terms of manipulating President Trump. If you go back and listen to Graham's comments, which I reviewed earlier this morning because I was too busy yesterday to do so. And he talked about saying, well, Putin has got to learn that you cannot play Trump. And that really struck me as an interesting statement because that kind of statement would really appeal to President Trump. Nobody can play me. I'm Trump. I'm the tough guy. I'm the boss. You can't play me. Putin's not going to play me. Well, of course, that's all irrelevant nonsense.
Yeah, I do think there's something to that Trump's ego is at the centerpiece of, his mentality toward issues a lot of time, and he needs his ego to be satiated at times. So that actually is kind of a masterful tactic to manipulate him, and I think that's probably a good observation. The idea that Lindsey Graham was even within a mile of these diplomatic parties and the negotiation parties is absurd, but that's the Washington we've grown accustomed to, where it's not, a single party effort driving us into war. It's a multi-party effort driving us to war, including the remnants of the neocons, of which Lindsey Graham is maybe the chief representative of.
Nothing to do with actually what's happening on the ground, never did. But I'm sure that appealed in some ways to President Trump. But then in the subsequent 24 hours, I think President Trump began to look at some, grim realities. We have 8 days worth of missiles right now in our inventory. I'm talking about Standard missiles, Patriot missiles. I don't know how many theater high altitude defense missiles we have. But the point is, after 8 days, we run out. And my sources inside the Department of Defense say, after 8 days, the conventional war is over and you have to go to a nuclear weapon. And I don't think President Trump wants to do that. So I think what he's doing is pretty typical for what most politicians do, Judge. He wants to be a little bit pregnant. Well, how do you get a little bit pregnant? Well, you give some things, but not everything. So in the final analysis, what has he changed? Nothing. Nothing fundamentally has changed at this point. And the interesting part is that my sources, and I do have some inside the administration, tell me that behind the scenes, there are talks between Moscow and Washington at very high levels, and they seem to be going well. So, this is more of the same. It's politicians don't like to be decisive. They don't like to take firm positions unless they're absolutely confident that everything will go their way. So I think what you're getting from President Trump is half a loaf, which in the final analysis on the battlefield will be no loaf at all.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I don't think we're going to see, a stunning reversal of the tides of this war in the trenches where it really is being fought. Zelensky's tried to do everything he can to bring this into the media and, as a marketer to get more money and do PR stunts like the bombing of Russian bombers, which didn't change, the realities on the ground in the trenches at all. But, maybe we're just on board with status quo policy. It's interesting to say, that, or to see that he said that talks with Russia were going well, actually, because everything that I see seems to indicate that, talks are essentially at a stalemate and have been so since they've been opened, especially after, Ukraine did some of those strikes. The U.S. has continued to bankroll this war. The U.S. has, supported and talked as if they were CNN in some regards. Trump himself saying, spouting the most common propaganda about this war that, Putin's going to conquer all of Ukraine. He wants all of Ukraine, and we have to be there to stop him. And this whole it's Biden's war thing isn't working anymore, even on Trump's base. Trump had a lot of political capital to stop this if he wanted, but instead he sided with the neocons and the military-industrial complex and establishment Democrats on this policy of continuing to arm Ukraine in essentially the same ways. Now, I'm glad they're not trying to go for a no-fly zone now, but the American people that elected Trump expected a lot more in terms of curtailing U.S. involvement in this war, if not eliminating it outright.
Here's the clip to which I think you're referring from Senator Graham. Chris, cut number 2.
I expect in the coming days you will see weapons flowing at a record level to help Ukraine defend themselves. I expect in the coming days that there will be tariffs and sanctions available to President Trump he's never had before. I expect in the coming days more support from Europe regarding their efforts to help Ukraine. Putin made a miscalculation here. For 6 months, President Trump tried to entice Putin to the table. The attacks have gone up, not down. One of the biggest miscalculations Putin has made is to play Trump. And you just watch. In the coming days and weeks, there's going to be a massive effort to get Putin to the table. And to those who are helping him, China buying cheap Russian oil and having no accountability, those days are about over.
Russia's already pretty sanctioned up, by the way, and even Rubio said that at the beginning of this administration. If you remember him talking about this, he said, this administration's been sanctioned to the brim, and it hasn't actually changed anything in terms of how the war is going or whether Russia wants to continue to fight it. In fact, a lot of these regimes just actually take benefit from the sanctions regime that the U.S. imposes on it because they have a new tool of propaganda. They can say, hey, all of our economic plights are because of these vile creatures across the sea that are bankrolling this war and still trying to hurt you. And that it does hurt the Russian people much more so than the Russian government.
How naive is he if he thinks that President Putin would come to the table, using his phrase, before his military objectives, which he's on the cusp of reaching, have been achieved?
Well, it's absurd. And again, President Putin has always made his position, the position of Russia, very, very clear. That's never changed. The real question here is why should the Russians believe anything we say? This goes all the way back to the coup in 2014, the subsequent Minsk Accords, the arms control arrangements that we unilaterally dismissed out of hand is unnecessary. Why believe anything we say? And I think President Putin has been very straightforward and honest with President Trump. And people keep telling President Trump, well, he has to give something. If he doesn't give up his position in some way, you lose. You have to be a winner. This is the confusing aspect of the whole thing because President Trump was far more rational 8 or 9 months ago when he recognized there was nothing happening in this area called Eastern Ukraine that justified the expenditure of American blood and treasure, nothing to be won, and that he really wanted to end the war.
Yeah, I totally agree with him there. 8 months ago happens to coincide with, I don't know, the election season and the campaign that he was running at the time. And that is what Americans wanted to hear. Americans are sick and tired of this war, generally. There are some that aren't, but at some point, nothing's changing. And what we're looking at here is another Afghanistan, a 20-plus year involvement in a military theater that's even more wrong-headed because it goes against a nuclear power. So I'm with Macgregor here. Putin has been pretty straightforward about what he wants, and that's no Ukraine in NATO, very clear one there. He's constantly repeated that was in his draft treaty that he sent to NATO when he said, I won't invade as long as you don't include Ukraine in NATO and you stop talking about that possibility. He wants less NATO involvement, including dual purpose missiles essentially on his border. That's a reasonable desire too. That's exactly what the U.S. would have as a desire if Russia tried to do this on the border of Mexico, or cooed Mexico's government and then tried to, replace it with a government that was adversarial toward the United States, which is exactly what the United States did in Ukraine in the winter of 2014, I think in February. So yeah, Macgregor's on point here.
But every time he's tried to end the war, he's got people like Lindsey Graham saying, now, come on there, President, you've been played. Don't you understand? You've been played. And that kind of thing, I think, sadly resonates with President Trump.
All right. That was pretty good. I didn't expect that from Macgregor, but that's a pretty spot-on impression of Graham. But I'm not really with Macgregor when it comes to this. At some point, Trump is culpable too. The buck stops here. Yeah, he's surrounding himself with terrible people, and that, I think, goes a long way to influence him in the wrong directions. But ultimately, his instincts at times seem to have been to draw U.S. forces back and draw down and disengage, and he hasn't done that. You have to assign some of the culpability onto Trump. And I'm not saying Macgregor hasn't. Actually, I think Macgregor has at various times that I've seen him on these podcasts. So just wanted to make that clear, though.
You listen to him on the golf course, and he says, you've been played. You can't allow this to happen. It's a lot of nonsense. We don't have any interest whatsoever in what happens in eastern Ukraine. We never did. And Trump has always had it within his power to end this thing by simply declaring that and pulling out. But we want to be seen, or President Trump wants to be seen, as the heroic figure that brought about peace. Well, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I totally think that. But I think the issue with it is to bring about peace, you have to stop bankrolling this war. I think actually Russia would respect the U.S. as a peace mediator if it cut off all aid and then served as a third-party mediator. And I'm not even saying that that's the best thing. I think the best thing for Americans and taxpayers is just that the U.S. disengage and leave that to Europe and whoever wants to deal with that. And Zelensky's hand would be forced. He'd have to sign a peace. And it wouldn't be as good of a peace as he could have gotten in Istanbul, by the way. And that's Zelensky's fault. That's Boris Johnson's fault. And that's the fault of the U.S. State Department. They put Ukraine on what Mearsheimer called the primrose path, the idea that things would go swimmingly with all this Western and NATO support in this war, when in fact it really, put Ukrainians in peril. So, yeah, just wanted to make that clear. We are on the path to destruction as long as we continue on this war, and we'll never be seen as a negotiator as long as we're in the bag completely for one side of the war to the tune of $200 billion. That's actually worth pointing out.
Right. I wonder if Senator Graham and his colleagues that agree with him still think they can use the war in Ukraine as a battering ram with which to drive President Putin from office. We haven't heard that articulated recently at all.
No, look, they still live in a fantasy world. As we've said repeatedly from the beginning, they continue to believe the nonsense that Russia is weak, that Russian society is fragile, that Putin is a quote-unquote hated dictator. We are the good liberal Democrats that want to bring peace and happiness everywhere, which in reality means we want to bring in a bunch of some of the lowest forms of human life in the private sector to rape Russia, steal everything they can from it while we put a puppet in Moscow. Well, that's failed. That's not going to happen. Now people are really turning their attention to try and repeat that process against Iran. But as far as Russia is concerned, that's over. And this is not going to affect anything the Russians do. They're going to proceed as scheduled. And, 50 days is an interesting selection. In 50 days, the Russians could be standing on the Polish border.
Right.
Yeah, what's interesting is so much of the neocon and pro-war propaganda when it comes to Ukraine focuses on this idea of Putin as a dictator. And look, I don't like any government. I don't like any rulers across the world, including my own. But when it comes to the three countries involved in this struggle, the three primary ones, the United States, Ukraine, and Russia, Russia's presidential election, for all the talk of, being for democracy and defending Ukraine for democracy. Russia's presidential election is actually the most democratic in terms of democratic principles because they have a national popular election to elect their president. The U.S. has an electoral college, which I favor, by the way. If I have to pick between the two, the electoral college is more decentralized and requires winning broad geographical coalitions rather than, stuffing all the populists and all the voting, get out the vote efforts into the biggest cities in the country. I like that idea more. And Ukraine hasn't even had elections since they were supposed to in 2024 because they're in wartime. They're invoking what's in their constitution that allows for that. But at some point you get backed into the corner when you've unleashed all this propaganda about defending democracy when Russia's presidential election is the most democratic. Ukraine doesn't have democracy. They're just suspending elections and, barring adversarial political parties, shutting down adversarial media, shutting down Eastern Orthodox churches, all these things Zelensky's done. And the U.S. doesn't even have that semblance of an electoral mechanism in the form of its presidency, too. So all this propaganda is crazy, and we're seeing that play out. They don't stop talking about it, but the reality is the reality.
Right. You mentioned Iran, Colonel. Did Trump's bombing of Iran make the Middle East more stable or more volatile?
Not only is it more volatile, we are at war with Iran, and people don't seem to understand it. Simply because President Trump dropped bombs and then said, well, that's it. Now we want peace. I'm sending over coffee and sandwiches this afternoon, and we're going to get along and work together, is irrelevant. We are a co-belligerent with Israel at war in the region. And effectively, we're at war with everybody because Israel's at war with everyone at this stage. So, I think people don't understand. There was an Israeli named Yanon who back in the 1980s set forth a plan for the region. And it didn't work out quite as anticipated, but 40 years later, it now rings true. And he simply said, our first goal in the region is fragmentation, division. In other words, break up the region into smaller packets that are more easily managed by us. In addition to that, once they're fragmented, we want to pit them against each other. Then we want to subjugate, clean up, and ultimately resettle areas with Jews, replacing the populations who are there. That's what Bibi Netanyahu is all about. That's what he's doing. It's kind of interesting if you go back and look at Sharon and Gaza. We had problems with what Sharon was doing in Gaza in about 2001 through 2003. And ultimately, President Bush at the time told Sharon to get out of Gaza. And ultimately, they got out. He wanted to go in there and bulldoze houses and level places. And we said, we're not going to support that. Get out of Gaza. So he got out of Gaza. He came up with this new arrangement.
Yeah, I'm mostly with Macgregor here. The fact that we are still at war with Iran is lost on so many people because of how Trump sold this, I think successfully to some extent, that, hey, this war's over, we took the off-ramp to peace, but no, there's a ceasefire. We know that Israel has a big track record of violating ceasefires. I actually looked into this. They violated 900 ceasefires even in the last few years. And Trump kind of greenlit their ability to violate ceasefires in Gaza, including one that he orchestrated as he stepped into the Oval Office. So yeah, we're still at war with Iran, and in many ways this reminds me of the situation in Iraq. After the first Gulf War, the U.S. kind of drew down, maintained presence in some of the military bases in the Arabian Peninsula, but also sanctioned Iraq to the tune of, causing hundreds of thousands of deaths, maintaining a no-fly zone, etc. And the war was only set to continue, well, I think some similar dynamics will exist here, because now Iran isn't going to have IAEA inspections. There's no path to normalization with the U.S. for a new JCPOA arrangement. If I'm an Iranian nationalist and an Iranian patriot, I want us to fast-track nukes immediately because of what just happened to us, the constant antagonism over the decades from Israel and the United States. And, nothing tells me that their civilian populace is less likely to support that now, especially after being attacked by Israel. So we're still in war here, and it's only a matter of time before the war propaganda gets unleashed again, and you see Netanyahu and the neocons talking about how they're weeks away from a nuke, and the U.S. has to enact a regime change there or else. And, that's been happening essentially my entire adult life and some of my youth, by the way.
It turned Gaza into a larger concentration camp, but at least it ended the intrusive measures by the Israelis on the ground. They got out, and the idea was that they would focus on securing Israel. Well, the roles have changed. It's no longer a question of the president telling the prime minister of Israel what to do. Right now, it is Bibi Netanyahu who tells Donald Trump what he wants him to do. And that's the true change that's happened over the last 20 plus years.
Yeah, and I hate to say Trump is willing to oblige on that at almost every step. We saw that with Iran and also the situation that's just devastating in Gaza, a genocide that's being bankrolled by the U.S. and Trump. And meanwhile, Trump sings the praises of Netanyahu, pleads with the Knesset to dismiss corruption and fraud charges against him, which, by the way, probably would have taken him down if not for October 7th. That was happening, right before October 7th happened. So that's where we're at. But bring this back to Ukraine. In Ukraine, over the last decades, there's been so many parachute cords by which the U.S. and the U.S. government could pull and get out of this thing and avert war, additional catastrophes, hundreds of thousands of deaths. Many think 1 million deaths on the Ukrainian side. Expanded conscription laws, especially in Ukraine on this, where old men are kind of just taken off the streets and sent to this state slavery of war. That's what conscription is, and it's no different in our country than it is there when it's practiced. Thankfully, that hasn't been practiced in the U.S. for a long time, though the selective service still exists and, maintains the right to do that in the future if it wants to, which that's downright treacherous if you're asking me. It is a form of slavery for sure, and in some ways the worst form of slavery. You're being enslaved to the state for the purposes of war, and often it's stupid and senseless wars like the war in Ukraine. So I don't think this war ends anytime soon on the path we're going down. With Trump supplying additional arms, this is a lucrative venture for the military-industrial complex. The Raytheons and Lockheed Martins and Boeings and Northrop Grummans of the world are extremely powerful. They have a lot of push and pull in Washington, and if they want this to go on, the administration seems to be willing to make any excuse they can to have this go on, whether it's something Putin said that they didn't like at the time, or, an offensive in the Donbass. They don't want to seem to really do what it takes to give up leverage from the U.S. position, specifically in supplying aid to Ukraine to end the war. But that, I think, is ultimately what would be necessary. I do think he's right. Macgregor's right about Trump wanting to play peacemaker and really have it in his legacy that he was the man to bring peace to that region, bring peace to this war, because it truly probably would be his biggest political accomplishment. But what he doesn't understand, and is being misled by many of his cronies and subordinates, is that he thinks the U.S. can continue to bankroll this war and be the peacemaker. I don't think he can. He'd have to be a third-party peacemaker, much like, Theodore Roosevelt was in 1905 to end the Sino-Japanese War, serving as, the chief negotiator there when the U.S. wasn't really involved in that war. That's what it would take. But I don't think Trump is willing to indulge that, especially when he surrounds himself by people like Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham, both of which he's constantly praised and both of which have terrible foreign policy ideas, especially Graham lately. But I do want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments below. Do you see the war in Ukraine ending anytime soon? What is the biggest impediment to that? Do you think that this war could go on for years and years under this direction? Or do you think that realistically it will end in a shorter period than that? Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Napolitano. His show is awesome. And please consider supporting me by becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you'll support the channel and you'll get access to all my videos before they come out to the general public on YouTube. I'd really appreciate that if you go those lengths to support me. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.